Okay, I think we are ready to begin. We are still admitting some of the attendees. We have nearly 100 persons joining so far. So colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Ines Mohammed, and I work for the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. I serve there as the Africa Coordinator on Security Council Resolution 1540, and I am honored to moderate today's webinar. On behalf of the co-organizers, the Office for Disarmament Affairs and the South African Institute of International Affairs, I warmly welcome all participants to the launch of the joint policy brief entitled Resolution 1540 and the African Continental Free Trade Area, Policy Options to Strengthen Non-Proliferation Controls and Secure Trade. We have about 200 persons who have registered for this webinar from 5 different continents, and I think we have over 100 that have joined us so far. We are grateful for your time and your interest. Before we begin, I want to make a few announcements about the Zoom platform. The webinar will be held in English, but French interpretation is available. You can choose your preferred language from the globe icon that you should see at the bottom of your screen. We will also administer 4 polls during the webinar. The purpose of these polls is to gather views and perceptions on today's topic, and they will also help us assess the value and the impact of the policy brief and the panel discussion. So we would greatly appreciate your response to the polls once they pop up on your screen. And please note that these polls will be conducted anonymously. We will not be collecting your information. I now wish to make a few remarks about the topic of today's webinar and why ODA has partnered with SAIIA on producing the policy brief. As many of you may know, ODA's mission is to work with member states, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector towards the elimination of weapons of mass destruction and the strict control of conventional weapons. To this end, ODA promotes global norms and supports the national implementation of multilateral disarmament and non-proliferation agreements. We recognize that in order to do so effectively, we must tailor our approach to the regional security and development agendas. This is especially the case for our work in Africa, where member states contend with a multitude of security challenges while also pursuing critical development priorities. And therefore, ODA aligns and tailors its support to the flagship projects of Agenda 2063 for inclusive and sustainable growth. The Silencing the Guns Roadmap is among the key flagship projects of Agenda 2063 that guides our cooperation with member states and regional organizations, particularly on issues of combating illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons and preventing diversion in arms trade. Additionally, we recognize the interdependence of security and development, and thus the importance of ensuring that disarmament and non-proliferation instruments are implemented in a manner that reinforces rather than restrict or detract from development efforts. It is against this background that we saw the value of exploring the interplay between Security Council Resolution 1540 and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The CFTA is projected to boost Africa's income by approximately $450 billion by the year 2035. It also promises to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty. It is also important to highlight that the CFTA is geared towards transforming African economies, and this will be realized, among other things, through the intensification of intra-African trade in goods and services, and by also boosting productivity and value addition in the mining and manufacturing sectors. Border security, transnational organized crime, and illicit trafficking in all its forms is a matter of concern for member states in the region, and one that is awarded a high priority on the continental security agenda. Considering the foreseen changes in the movements of goods, services, and people, as well as the rise in industrial productivity, we can expect that the extent and scope of border security risks will also change. This is especially when coupled with transnational and transregional threats and a shifting global security environment. With these issues in mind, ODA and SAIIA embarked on developing the policy brief. I would like to underline that this brief is a cursory and not an exhaustive exploration of the interplay between Resolution 54 and the CFTA. Our hope is that the brief will form the foundation for further dialogue and joint action amongst the relevant stakeholders. Therefore, we highly appreciate your interest and look forward to your feedback and ideas during and after the webinar. As we begin, I'd like to describe briefly the structure of today's discussion. We will begin with a statement from the Security Council Committee established pursuant to Resolution 1540, also known as the 1540 Committee. And the committee is represented here today by Mr. Alexei Baranin, who is a member of the committee's group of experts, and we are grateful for his participation. Following the statements, the co-author of the policy brief, Professor Joanne Sivanwick and Ms. Isabel Bosman, will deliver a presentation overviewing the contents of the document, its conclusions, as well as the recommendations. After the presentation, we will invite the discussant and subject matter expert, Mr. Scott Spence, to help us contextualize and offer his experts on the themes and other issues that are highlighted in the policy brief. The co-authors and the discussants will then exchange views and respond to questions and comments from the attendees. Comments and views from all attendees are, of course, highly welcome and appreciated and also strongly encouraged. Please do post them as they come to mind on the Q&A box that should appear at the bottom of your screen. And I will then relay them to the panelists at the appropriate time. You also have the option to post your questions and comments anonymously if you prefer to do so. I am now pleased to start today's discussion. And before we begin, I am pleased to give the floor to Mr. Alexei Baranin to deliver the statement on behalf of the 1540 Committee. Alexei, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. The chair of the 1540 Committee is unable to attend this meeting. I am authorized by the 1540 Committee to make a statement on behalf of the chair. I warmly welcome you to the webinar to launch a policy brief entitled Resolution 1540 and the African Continental Free Trade Area, Policy Options to Strengthen Non-Proliferation Controls and Secure Trade. African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is a long-term project aimed at strengthening the development and socio-economic integration of Africa. The agreement establishes a single African market and aims to expand intercontinental trade. The 1540 Committee believes that creation of regional free trade areas and zones should not result in uncontrolled cross-border transit of sensitive items and technologies within the scope of the Resolution 1540 of 2004. States, regardless of their participation in such cooperative frameworks, continue to bear full responsibility for fulfilling their obligations under this resolution. The United Nations Security Council, in its Resolution 1540 and follow-up resolutions, expresses gravely concern about the threat of illicit trafficking in nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their means of delivery, as well as related materials, which adds a new dimension to the issue of proliferation of such weapons, as well as a threat of international peace and security. The Security Council decides in operative paragraph 3D of Resolution 1540 that all states shall establish, develop, review, and maintain appropriate, effective national export and transshipment controls over such items. It also recognizes in operative paragraph 6 the utility in implementing this resolution of effective national control lists and calls upon all member states, when necessary, to pursue at the earliest opportunity to development of such lists. However, each state obviously determines the corresponding legislative base and the modalities of its export control mechanism on its own accord within without any external pressure or control. The 1540 Committee much appreciates efforts of South African Institute of International Affairs and the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs with regard to prevent the danger of potential nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons proliferation, as reflected in policy options to strengthen non-proliferation controls and secure trade. The committee believes that the policy brief provides a good ground for further improvement of African states' legislation governing the proper non-proliferation export and border control regime, which would be consistent with the expected significant boost intra-African trade. The 1540 Committee encourages the state parties of the African Continental Free Trade Area to consider incorporation of relevant items in voluntary national action plans that address the elaboration of national laws and enforcement measures to implement Resolution 1540. Effective implementation of Resolution 1540 offers significant advantages with respect to the establishment and consolidation of a zone of peace, security, stability, and development at the national, sub-regional, regional, and global levels. Assistance that can be provided by states and international organizations to implement Resolution 1540 can complement or contribute to capacity building, for example, in border and customs controls, transport safety and security. Resolution 2325 of 2016 in its operative paragraph 25 encourages international, regional, and sub-regional organizations to highlight the obligations of Resolution 1540 in their model legislation and/or guidelines where appropriate pertaining to instruments under their mandate relevant to the resolution. It should be pointed out that the most recent Security Council resolution 2663 of 2022 reaffirms the need for all member states to comply fully with their obligations and fulfill their commitments in relation to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation in all its aspects of all weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. While Resolution 1540 of 2004 implementation progress remains uneven between the various provisions and regionally, Resolution 2663 of 2022 notes the need for more attention on, among others, national export and transshipment controls. It also stresses the importance of a tailored dialogue and engagement of the 1540 Committee with member states and recognizes the specificity of states with regard to implementation and reporting. It also requests the 1540 Committee to continue to organize and participate in outreach events on the implementation of Resolution 1540 at the international, regional, sub-regional, and as appropriate national level, including as appropriate inviting parliamentarians, as well as representatives of civil society, including industry and academia, and promote the refinement of these outreach efforts to focus on specific thematic and regional issues related to implementation. In conclusion, I wish to express sincere gratitude to the South African Institute and Office for Disarmament Affairs for their work, and I'm confident that the policy brief will be another step toward full implementation of Resolution 1540. The committee looks forward to further dialogue with states and interested regional and sub-regional bodies, including in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Alexei, for your time, and we greatly appreciate the continued engagement of the 1540 Committee in this project. I would like to inform the attendees that in the process of developing this document, we have held a number of consultations, including with the 1540 Committee, with the CFTA Secretariat, and we had a validation expert roundtable late last year to look at the first draft of this document, and we have benefited greatly from inputs from the 1540 Committee, from the CFTA Secretariat, but also from other experts from the region and beyond. And we are grateful for their contribution in making this the document that it is now. And thank you, Alexei, for touching upon a number of important points that we will be delving into later in the discussion, including the specificity of states and how implementation can and should be tailored to the regional and national priorities, needs, and capacities. With this, and before we move to the presentation of the policy brief itself, we will administer the first poll. Chen, if you could kindly put that one up. So as I mentioned, we have about 4 polls that we will administer at different points of the webinar. And this first question pertains to the current knowledge levels when it comes to both Resolution 1540 as well as the CFTA. We have had nearly 250 registrations for this webinar, and they included persons from academia, think tanks, civil society, government experts, as well as the private sector and industry. So clearly quite a diverse audience, and it would be interesting to know what the current levels are on both trade issues and in Africa specifically, but also on Resolution 1540, considering the importance of collaboration between security sectors and civilian sectors in the implementation of the resolution. So we're logging in nearly 100 responses so far, and we have about 140 participants, which is a very encouraging number. We'll give everyone a few more seconds to log in their responses. Please note that there are 2 questions in this poll. You can scroll down on the screen that popped up. All right, so I will end the poll now and share with you the results. As you can see, it's almost equal amongst all of the options. We have participants who have a good level of knowledge about both 1540 and the CFTA. We have 29% that have fair knowledge and 38% that have limited knowledge on these topics. So we are hopeful that this webinar and the policy brief and our future work will help enhance awareness about these instruments and their interlinkages. I will stop sharing now, and I am now happy to introduce the co-authors of this policy brief, Professor Joanse van Wyk and Ms. Isabel Bosman. I have had the pleasure of working with them over the past nearly 12 months, since the inception of this project up to its culmination today. And it's been a great pleasure working with them, and I am grateful for their advice, contribution, ideas, but also in-depth knowledge about trade issues in the African continent, as well as security issues. So I will give the floor to Isabel. She will begin, and then she will hand over to Joanse later on.
Thank you so much, Ines. I'm going to share the presentation. Okay, I hope that is visible to everyone. Thank you for your introduction, Ines. And indeed, I would also just like to, from our side, express our gratitude to everyone involved in making today happen. And to you, Ines, as you mentioned, it's been more or less 12 months of working together on this. And yeah, I'm very happy that we're at this much anticipated day where we can officially launch the policy brief and share it with you. Our presentation will roughly follow the same layout as the policy brief, but because we would still like you to read it, we're not going to go into too much detail, but my co-author, Professor Ansie van Wyk, and I will highlight some of the most important elements of the policy brief. And so my session will focus on a lot of the what questions and relating to the poll we just had. And the first question I will be answering is, what is UN Security Council Resolution 1540? Simply put, Resolution 1540 is a legally binding instrument that was enacted by the UN Security Council under its Chapter 7 powers on the 28th of April 2004 to address and prohibit weapons of mass destruction proliferation, specifically chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons by non-state actors. Under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the Security Council can determine the existence of any threat to peace and can then make recommendations or decide on a full course of action and measures to be taken to mitigate such a threat. Chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons proliferation depends on a myriad of technologies, equipment, and materials that also have several peaceful or civilian applications outside of the known military applications, and these items are known as dual-use goods. To realize the objectives of Resolution 1540, concrete transfer controls therefore become necessary components of the international trade system to ensure that such items are not diverted from their peaceful applications and used in WMD proliferation by non-state actors. Because it was enacted under its Chapter 7 powers by the UN Security Council, Resolution 1540 is binding on all UN member states, and it obliges these states to refrain from providing any form of support to non-state actors that attempt to develop, acquire, manufacture, possess, transport, transfer, or use any of the chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, their related materials, and their means of delivery. Broadly, Resolution 1540 covers three categories. The first is political commitments to its obligations. The second, legal or legislative measures, and the third relating to domestic controls. And it is here where border and export controls of dual-use items come into play. This latter category relates specifically to operative paragraph 3 of Resolution 1540, and it also forms the primary focus of the policy brief developed by SAIIA and the UNODA. Looking briefly at some key provisions and states' obligations under Resolution 1540, these are contained in its three operative paragraphs. The first, operative paragraph 1, the no state support paragraph, requires that state must not provide support of any kind to non-state actors attempting to develop, possess, acquire, or transfer any chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons and their means of delivery. In terms of operative paragraph 2, states are required to adopt and enforce laws that prohibit non-state actors from engaging in the activities described in operative paragraph 1, as well as the financing of such activities. And then operative paragraph 3 refers to controls over related materials, and it calls on states to ensure that measures are in place for accounting for and securing such items, provide for their physical security, implement border controls to detect, deter, and combat illicit trafficking, and institute export and transshipment controls, end-user controls, and penalties for actions found in violation of legal measures for prohibiting the proliferation of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons by non-state actors. And then before handing over to my co-author, Joansi van Wyk, maybe we'll look at the specific interplay between Resolution 1540 and the AfCFTA. It is also important to consider specifically why this resolution is relevant to Africa. And this includes looking at AU commitment as well as state implementation of Resolution 1540. In writing this policy brief, we found that Resolution 1540 is relevant to Africa for a number of reasons, including the perennial prevalence and threat of terrorism and illicit trade networks, growing African interest in nuclear energy and other civilian applications, of nuclear material, greater involvement of industry in development cooperation. This was especially witnessed during the COVID-19
Isabel, can you hear us? Isabel's sounds and video has gone off, and she did inform us earlier that she's having a bit of connectivity problems on her side today. Joansi, will you be able to take over from here?
Yes, I can do that. Thank you very much, Enos. I hope you can hear and see me. As Isabella said, we just want to thank you very much for the opportunity to work with you and UNODA, and of course, all the other colleagues that have been involved in this. If I can just get control of the presentation.
Yes, sure. Our Zoom host, Chen, he has a copy of the presentation, so he will now display it and give you authority to scroll through.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chan. I can start here. Isabel has mentioned the fact that there is a strong historical commitment to non-proliferation on the continent. And when we go to the next slide, we want to have a look at how does Africa and 1540 relate to one another. So we see that by the time that the resolution was adopted in 2004, the continent had already had a number of commitments made. One of them is in 1996, the African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, or the Pelindaba Treaty that entered into force 2009, but of course, opening for signature 96. In 2004, the same year of the adoption of the resolution, the Common African Defence and Security Policy, and then also in 2004, the Protocol to the Convention on the Prevention and the Combating of Terrorism. So we see two things here, that there is a high-level commitment from the African Union, besides these predating historical commitments. We also see that the African Union at the heads of state, Assembly of Heads of State and the Peace and Security Council have acknowledged the importance of this UN resolution and have also made reference to it in a number of subsequent decisions, communiques, etc. We also see that there is a national commitment to the resolution 5040 among African states, and that is commendable. 47 of Africa's 55 states have submitted at least one report as required by the UN Security Council to the committee, although 7 of the 8 UN member states that have never submitted a report are African. Let us remind ourselves, it is a UN Security Council resolution which is legally binding on all states. Moving on to the next slide, we can see here that there are an uptake in the number of countries that have, of course, adopted and provided documentation on their commitments and their practical implementation thereof. But we see also on operational paragraph 3, C and D, that border controls have overall also seemed to have significantly improved on the continent. And this bodes well for the context of the what is happening in the African Continental Free Trade Area. Moving on, we can then look at some of the convergences between the resolution and the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, we must remember that trading in terms of the agreement has officially started on 1st January 2021, basically a year into COVID-19 pandemic, and we're about 2 years into this now. So our policy brief, as Eynās has mentioned, emerged from the realization that there is a strong commitment by the continent to use trade as a developmental tool, but that there is already evident that Resolution 5040 and the agreement speaks to one another, and that can help us to strengthen not only the agreement and the objective of free trade across the continent, but can also add to the objectives of Resolution 5040. So whereas the free trade agreement and the area aims to remove trade barriers, Resolution 5040 calls for border and export controls to manage risk of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapon states by non-proliferation by non-state actors. So we see that illicit legal trade is an important focus area, especially when considering the vast development opportunities offered by not only African trade with the outside of the continent, but also international trade within the borders. Moving on, we can then see that it is very important that, and this is what Isabel and myself had concluded, is that there is no conflict between Resolution 5040 and the free trade agreement. For us, there is convergence, more complementarity, and also that the free trade agreement and the resolution are almost mutually enabling one another. So one of the conclusions that we said is that it is an enabler of trade flows and economic development within a reliable, secure, and a predictable regional trading system. We see that there are a number of opportunities that emanate from the institutionalization of these measures. For example, strengthening existing international trade issues such as control and export, and existing conventions like the Chemical Biological Weapons Convention, which many African states are already parties to. But we must be more mindful that although Resolution 5040 does not address explicitly development, it places a high value on cooperation and the importance of controlling goods and at least give account to these goods so that trade can take place. And we know from literature and practical experience that peace in itself creates a favorable environment for trade. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement realizes this, that international security is very important in this. Moving on to the next slide. So it is very important to note also what the agreement says, that it is the obligation of states in international law that shall be construed not to prevent any states from giving practice to its obligations. So for us, the complementarity is very important. The protocol on trade and goods of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has 9 annexes that refer to border management and customs management. And here is another convergence with Resolution 5040, but also then create opportunity that trade in goods is then easily facilitated. And for this reason, it has instituted a subcommittee for trade facilitation. And for us, it's important to reiterate the role of industry. We've seen during the COVID pandemic how important it is for Africa to be fully included and integrated into the international community and trade and regulation system, but also within the continent, so that vaccines can move, that pharmaceutical development can take a significant role. We've seen heavy industries trade in goods has dominated African trade by the time it was signed, but we are expecting it to continue and play a greater role, and Eynās has referred to some expected figures by 2030. So industrial and commercial demand for sophisticated goods and services and products, which can be dual use in nature, is expected to grow. And here is then the opportunity to be mindful of the purpose and the obligations of the agreement for the free trade area, but also then mindful of the obligations of Resolution 5040. So we have seen that there is a growth in Africa's industrialization and manufacturing over the last decade. Moving on to the latter part of my presentation, here is an index provided that gives an indication of the commitments to non-proliferation and the trades in certain goods that relate to that. I would advise you to, in the interest of time, to perhaps consult that on page, I think, 26 of the report. If we can move on to figure 2, we see that there has also been an increase in the number of import records by country. So clearly there is a more robust African trade and export-import taking place. And this is what the African Free Trade Agreement aims to achieve, but we must be mindful that this needs to take place within the obligations set out by the agreement, but also by the resolution. If we can move on to our next slide. So we've seen that the commitment is extremely strong, but there are a number of factors that prohibit or inhibit the practical implementation. And both our representative from the 5040 committee and Ines have referred to that, is that domestic environment means that they are competing national priorities. Moreover, to make this practical implementation often requires finances and expertise, which is not necessarily available. There are also regional and national security concerns that may be more important and more pressing. There seems to be a limited awareness also of what is not only the contents of the agreement, free trade agreement, but also of 1540. And then we've seen that civilian sectors, industry, for example, has seemingly been absent, predominantly absent from dialogues on 5040. So how do we go about achieve this? And this is basically the gist of the policy brief, is that we would like, as a pathway forward, to see deeper interinstitutional and multi-stakeholder relationships with civilian actors like industry, but also various sectors involved in trade, transport, agriculture, etc. Going on to our next slide, how do we then move from the resolution to the benefits and African development through trade? First of all, we must be mindful that 1540 and the agreement for free trade are legally binding on states in terms of the UN on all states, but also for the African Continental Free Trade Area, it is binding on states and predominantly all African states that have ascribed to it. More importantly, for investment and trade to take place, the resolution and both the agreement contributes to risk reduction and investor confidence. Once those two certainties are in place, in other words, clearly defined legislative environment, policing and security will then also contribute to confidence. And we see that in terms of the security, there is also an opportunity for convergence between existing African non-proliferation efforts to combat illicit trade, but also that is clearly aligned with 1540. It's just a matter of creating awareness. And then, of course, what exactly both 1540 and the agreement is that trade increase. There is a strong argument and evidence to suggest that trade flourishes in a secure environment, and of course more confidence and security will add to growth and of course the stature of the continent as a responsible actor in, and of course trader, manufacturer, etc., within the confines of dual-use goods. Now, let us look at the next slide, and then if Jan can just move that. So what are the opportunities for synergy? First of all, the very important one is that states have an obligation to cooperate. There is already high-level institutionalization taking place within the African Union, but also within the African Free Trade Agreements Council of Ministers. There is already evidence of convergence with the Resolution 1540. So, as both Ines and our guest have earlier indicated, is that there is a high premium on cooperation at all levels, sharing of expertise, lessons learned. So one of the key takeaways from this policy brief is that the agreement and its institutional framework can be a suitable platform to promote not only dialogue, cooperation and exchange, but also trade that is within the confines of universally accepted and legally binding border and export controls. Moving on to the last part, and here we are looking at specifically the pathways to peace. The two final slides, if we can move on, Jen, please. So, what are the pathways for action that in our research and in the consultations that have taken place can be used? So the Resolution 1540 has a set of matrices that can then form a shared understanding of what is expected in terms of this resolution, but also how can African states then have from the lessons learned and the experiences and the indices from the matrices, how that can assist African states, and also to fill the gaps in terms of the challenges. A second pathway for action is that not only is existing platforms and dialogue mechanisms are used, but also establish ones that perhaps are more suited for this. So ideally, to establish this that are dedicated to maintain the dialogue between the free trade organs, the 5040 committee, UNODA, and of course the various regional stakeholders and organizations. Another pathway for action is convergence, that we are clearly mindful of the convergence, to identify the approaches that can be used to harmonize export and border controls, not only to assist the African trade, but also to realize the objectives of this legally binding instrument, Resolution 5040. And then the existing data is available. It's a matter of also interpreting the data that is available through various UN databases, the Strategic Trade Atlas, to assess the flows of dual use, and then also to see where are the areas of improvement, the areas of challenges. Moving on to the last slide. Of course, to develop assistance and guidance tools that can support states. Earlier, we have said that there is a commitment by African states, but sometimes there is not enough expertise or awareness of what needs to be done. And here, guidance, assistance, and existing platforms can be used. And here, for example, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Continental Free Trade Area and the World Customs Organization that was signed approximately a year and a half ago. Apologies for that repetition of the existing data. I've already made that point, but also to engage non-state actors. Part of the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Area is also to get more actors involved. It is expected that once trade improves, there is likely to be an appetite for more sophisticated material, services, equipment, etc. And there, for example, it is important that African industries and the service sector, transport sector, should be made aware of what is expected within the Resolution 5040, but also in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, so that there are jointly an exploration of how, on the one hand, to reduce risk, proliferation risk, but also to enhance greater trade and then development opportunities on the continent. Most importantly, to prevent proliferation by non-state actors, as the resolution envisages, so that there is a safer environment, a safer international community, and to foster public-private cooperation. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we look forward to engage with you on the policy brief. Your comments and criticism will be very welcome. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joansi and Isabel, for compressing the contents of the policy brief in this presentation. And I hope all of the attendees have been able to follow and benefit from the key points that have been raised there. Of course, I would encourage all the attendees to peruse the policy brief document itself. You will find there more information, more explanation of some of the concepts that have been presented in this presentation, a deeper dive into the trends in Africa that are likely to give rise to increased trade and transfers of dual-use goods, including topics of vaccine security, energy security, value-added manufacturing, and so on. So thanks again very much for the co-authors for investing time and energy in putting this together. We have about 12 minutes left, and without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Scott Spence to help us unpack some of the concepts and the themes that have been highlighted in the policy brief. And Scott, I'd like to begin with the underlying argument in this policy brief, which is the fact that there is an economic benefit to be reaped by member states from implementing Resolution 1540. You have worked for the 1540 Committee, a group of experts, for nearly 5 years or more, and you have worked with countries in the region, but also in Asia and Latin America, in developing export control measures and legislation. Is this argument understood by national stakeholders? What kind of benefits are there really to be reaped, and how can we reinforce that message and unpack it? Thank you.
Thanks, Ines. And also I'd like to thank Professor Bosman and Professor Van Wyk for their publication. Congratulations as well to both of you, and also for that excellent presentation, which really does encapsulate the arguments in the policy brief, which I would encourage everyone to read. In terms of the economic benefits of strategic trade control, or STC, I mean, without a doubt, there are trade benefits. A recent PAC Forum study on this showed that in Asia, countries that implemented strategic trade controls increased their strategic trade dramatically. And when we're talking strategic trade, we're talking about components, parts, things that can indeed add value, but a lot of them, because they have dual use possibilities, they need to be tightly controlled for export control purposes. Should be emphasized that implementing STC should not be seen as a barrier to trade. And I think, frankly, this is probably one of the biggest obstacles we face when we're working with governments, is that they perceive it to be a barrier. They perceive it to be something that's imposed by the West, when in fact, the benefits to implementing this trade not only enhance your economy, increase your outputs on the value chain, but also, of course, and benefit national security and regional security. We were talking to one country recently. I don't want to name the country, but some of the benefits, I'd just like to briefly go over them, just to put these out there for consideration. It attracts, so STC, having your strategic trade control measures in place, attracts foreign investment. like I said, in high value and technology sectors. And we're looking at such sectors as semiconductors, advanced electronics, and pharmaceuticals. And to be very clear, some of the components and parts, chemicals, et cetera, for these advanced sectors are dual use. And therefore, the export of them from certain countries will be controlled. And those countries will be looking at other countries' legislation to see if they have themselves export control legislation, because their companies, their producers may be hesitant to export those goods to those countries. And those that produce them, those countries that want to build those sectors, they will be better placed to attract foreign investment if they have strategic trade control measures in place. And this leads to countries being able to expand their expand their exports and imports of strategic items. It also improves the efficiency of, and I think this is extremely important, of interministerial coordination in a national trade and investment management system. So many countries, in addition to working on their strategic trade controls, they're linking that to overhauls of their trade legislation or their commerce legislation to make it more fit for purpose for the 21st century, because the trade flows, the way that countries are trading with one another, also just the items that are being traded, it's changing dramatically. And this requires a high level of coordination at the government level. So working on strategic trade control measures also helps enhance your interministerial or interagency coordination. And I think very importantly, there are the soft benefits of this. Countries that have strategic trade control measures in place have an enhanced international image. It just goes without saying that countries that, for example, have recently adopted legislation such as Philippines with the STMA and other countries, they are going to be very attractive for investment, for production of higher end goods, because their international image has benefited from these measures. So I think, again, without question, STC having these measures in place does a great amount to enhance a country's economy. And linking this to the AfTC, I think, is extremely important, smart, and doing this at the regional level where countries can learn from one another as they're engaging in this process will be extremely useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. You spoke about the benefits in terms of confidence building between producing, recipient, and user states, the contribution to global stature and image, of course, as a result, but also greater interagency cooperation and much more efficient processes to balance the obligations between security and free trade. And you mentioned that there is generally maybe a lack of understanding, which creates a resistance to seeing the value of trade controls and dual use export controls and so on. How can states better assess their role, contribution, and share in the global dual use trade? And how can they accordingly then implement more evidence-based policies that are really suited, that are not going to become an extra burden on their customs officials or trade officials, but can actually help harmonize these processes? There is a question to that effect in the chat, that some might see the relationship between non-proliferation obligations and free trade a bit forced. So how would you respond to some of these topics?
Well, I think it has to be tackled in several different ways. First, there's the challenge of implementing strategic trade controls. It's not easy. And those of us working with states in this area, we're aware of that. It requires outreach to industry, and it also requires making your exporters, your brokers aware of impending legislation that may be coming their way, but also just for governments to organize themselves to get this process underway is very difficult. There's the legislative side, there's the regulatory side. We're working with a country right now where the question is coming up of whether they should have single window, should the process be divided among different ministries or agencies. So that's part of it. The other part of it is, okay, so we've decided as a country that we want to work on STC, or we've decided as a region, and we want to increase our trade. This is going to be good for our people. It's going to be good for our economies. How do we get help on this? How can we work with others who have gone through this process before? And I think that's where the 1540 Committee, UNODA, the US's Export and Border Security Program, EU's P2P, and I see that we have a representative in the participants list from P2P. This is where they can work with states to enhance their strategic trade controls. There's a lot of effort, time, and funding coming from the European Union, the US, Japan, and others to work with states to implement their strategic trade controls. In other words, they're not alone. There are also a lot of tools to do this. There is a lot of legislative assistance that's available. There is assistance for drafting control lists. Right now, there's a huge focus, for example, on using the EU control list under the revised regulation 281, which is a very useful list for a lot of countries. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. This wasn't necessarily the case 10 years ago where states were really struggling with how to develop a control list, but now the EU list is seen as best practice. Moreover, commodity identification, extremely important. That's really also another struggle for countries, but the good news is there's a lot of assistance available to work on this, either through EXPIS or P2P or WCO, the World Customs Organization. So it has to be tackled in different ways, and countries can learn from one another. The fact of the matter is, in Africa, there already is strategic trade. As you can see from the Strategic Trade Atlas, the really interesting diagrams that are included in this publication, there already is strategic trade. So the question is how to go about managing it within government, but also as a government, how to reach out to others who have gone through this process before to realize you're not alone and that there are ways to get this done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. And I'd also like to point out, in addition to what you said, not only is there strategic trade taking place on the continent, but many states have implemented measures in that regard. We know of South Africa's rich experience in export controls. Kenya, I believe, last year has passed its strategic trade control law. And I understand Morocco is also in the process of developing a strategic trade control law and framework altogether. So we can see greater understanding throughout the continent of these topics, and also moves towards enhancing implementation. The Africa region has a very rich culture of harmonized practices. There are many common frameworks, common practices, action plans that are regional and sub-regional. From your point of view, what aspects of Resolution 1540, and specifically as they pertain to export and border controls, lend themselves to harmonization? What type of measures that could be implemented and benefit the entire continent, or at least a sub-region where they can work together on developing some harmonized practices? Which aspects would those be?
Sure. Now, to be very clear, 1540 does not require states to do things to implement 1540 in any particular way. That is entirely a sovereign decision, but some regions are working together. And as you rightly point out, the African Union, like the European Union, is quite keen to harmonize its efforts. And the new CFTA is an excellent example of this. And it's exciting that we're looking at a 40% increase in trade within the next decade or so. One way of doing this, and let's, from a very practical point of view, is so-called peer reviews. We've had several of the examples of this, especially in Latin America. We've had peer reviews in Central Asia, where countries take a look at how they are implementing various aspects of 1540, including operative paragraphs 3C and D, which are focused on border control and export control and transshipment control and so on. The beauty of sort of linking up CFTA with 1540, and I think that's why this publication is so important, and the work that is being done here is so important, is that harmonization just makes everything a lot easier. When countries have their STC measures in place, if they, for example, use the EU control list, it's going to make it a lot easier for that country to register exports, register imports in such a way that they're harmonized with other countries. We have an example of this. Anyone on this in this meeting right now who is in customs, you're fully aware, of course, of the harmonized system for tariffs. And so 98% of the world is using that. It's obviously it's made customs, I mean, it's an extremely complex process, but it has helped harmonize tariffs by having this system in place. And so in a similar way, what we're seeing a movement towards is the harmonization of managing exports and imports by using, for example, a common list such as the EU control list. Now, again, No country is mandated, except for EU member states, are mandated to use that list. But what we're seeing is a lot of interest in the countries that we're working with outside the EU in using that list as just one way of harmonizing. But as I said, at a very practical level, there are ways for a couple of countries or 3 or more countries to do a peer review and just to see how they're implementing these measures, to see if in fact they can harmonize how they work together at a more microscopic level, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott, for this. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There is a lot that we could unpack, but we also don't want to keep people for longer than planned. This is an ongoing conversation, and we hope to receive your inputs, feedback, questions, ideas in writing. So I would strongly encourage all those in the webinar to reach out to us. If you have any comments, any questions, or any concerns about some of the points that have been raised in the policy brief, please don't hesitate to write to us. You will find our emails on the document, and you also already have my contact information from the previous correspondence. So thanks again very much to all of the speakers, to the 1540 committee for being here with us today, to the co-authors, and to you, Scott. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise on this topic. And thanks, of course, to all of the attendees that have expressed interest in the policy brief, in our work, and we hope to continue working with you in the future. As I mentioned, we have put this document in place, and we have released this policy brief, first of all, to reflect on the current extent of the risks that African states face when it comes to the illicit trafficking of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear material, as well as where do we stand in the continent with respect to the implementation of Resolution 1540, and particularly aspects relating to border and export controls. As has been underlined several times in this discussion, African states have expressed strong commitment to Resolution 1540, as we have seen from pronouncements made by the Summit of Heads of States of the African Union, as well as the AU Peace and Security Council. But clearly there are many implementation gaps that remain. Progress is being made, and encouragingly so, and we hope to continue working with member states in the region on addressing these gaps. Where do we go from here? We want to deepen and strengthen this dialogue. So we will be taking up some of the recommendations that have been laid out by the co-authors. That includes engaging and establishing or reinforcing existing platforms where we can discuss and speak to the stakeholders that are involved in the implementation at the national level. Trade officials, health officials, and also actors in the security sector. They are the ones who can guide and lead process, and we hope to bridge the gap between those different sets of actors. We also want to take a deeper look into Africa's strategic trade profile, understand the current scale of trade in dual-use goods in the continent, and what kind of trends we could expect to see in the future as the CFTA continues to be implemented. This will help us and help our member states have the evidence they need to develop the policies that are effective, that are efficient, and that reinforce the objectives of the CFTA. So once again, I invite you to share your thoughts and ideas with us at any time. There have been requests on the Q&A box for the presentation that has been delivered, as well as the statements made. We will be circulating all of those later today via email. And thanks once again for your interests. So before I close out, I would also like to thank Chen, the person behind the Zoom platform, and my dear colleague Natasha for making this happen as well, and also to Anna and Gilbert in interpretation. So thank you all very much and have a pleasant rest of the day, and we hope to hear from you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.